Jake Morrison walked through the empty halls of the human embassy for the last time. His footsteps echoed against the cold metal walls that had been his home for 3 long years. The boxes containing his personal belongings sat stacked by the main door, ready for transport back to Earth. Each box represented another failed attempt at building relationships with the alien species that controlled this part of the galaxy. The Galactic Council chambers were buzzing with activity as always, but none of the alien delegates bothered to acknowledge Jake as he passed through the central corridor. The tall blue Zephyrians moved past him with their usual air of superiority, their large eyes barely glancing in his direction. The insect-like Korathi clicked their mandibles in what Jake had learned was their version of dismissive laughter. Even the reptilian Valdris, who ran the council with iron claws, treated him like furniture that happened to speak. Jake remembered his first day, here when he still believed humanity could find its place among the stars. He had brought gifts from Earth, samples of human art and music, hoping to share the beauty of his species with these advanced civilizations. The gifts still sat unopened in storage, deemed unworthy of examination by beings who considered themselves the pinnacle of evolution. 3 years of diplomatic meetings had taught Jake that humans were seen as nothing more than primitive mammals who had stumbled into space travel by accident. Every proposal for trade agreements was rejected. Every request for territorial expansion was denied. Every offer of technological exchange was met with condescending smiles and patronizing comments about how humans needed more time to mature as a species. The final insult had come just last week when High Counselor Vexstar had publicly stated that humans were too aggressive and unpredictable to be granted full membership in the galactic community. The assembled delegates had nodded in agreement, as if the matter had been settled by someone far wiser than the foolish humans could ever hope to be. Jake sealed the last of his personal files and transmitted them to the secure Earth communication network. Among them was his final report to the Colonial Administration, a document that painted a clear picture of humanity's place in this galaxy. They were unwanted guests who had overstayed their welcome, and it was time to leave before they were forcibly removed. Meanwhile, thousands of light years away, Captain Lisa Grant stood on the bridge of the exploration vessel New Horizon as it completed its final survey of the Kepler system. The ship had been mapping potentially habitable worlds for future human colonization, but those plans had been scrapped 3 days ago when the recall order came through. Lisa had read the message twice before believing it was real. Operation Homecoming was not a retreat, according to the official documents. It was described as a strategic realignment of human priorities, but Lisa understood the real meaning. Humanity was giving up on finding a place in this galaxy's established order. They were going home to lick their wounds and figure out what came next. The crew of New Horizon worked efficiently to pack up their equipment and prepare for the long journey back to Earth. They had discovered 6 potentially habitable worlds. During their mission, worlds that would now remain empty while alien species continued to expand their own territories. Lisa felt a familiar anger building in her chest as she thought about the wasted opportunities and closed doors her species had faced. Dr. Kevin Price was having similar thoughts as he shut down his research station on Kepler 442b. The facility had been his life's work, a cutting-edge laboratory designed to study exotic matter and its potential applications. The research had progressed far beyond anything the Galactic Council believed humans were capable of, but Kevin had learned to keep his discoveries quiet. After several attempts to share his findings with alien scientists had been met with dismissive skepticism. The Zephyrians claimed that their understanding of physics was thousands of years ahead of human knowledge, so anything humans discovered must be either wrong or already known to superior minds. The Korathi were only interested in research that had immediate commercial applications, and they saw no profit in Kevin's theoretical work. The Valdris viewed any human scientific advancement as a potential threat to their position as the galaxy's technological leaders. Kevin carefully packed away his equipment, making sure to wipe all computer systems and destroy any physical evidence of his research. The official records would show that the station had been studying basic planetary geology, nothing more. What the aliens didn't know about human capabilities could not be used against humanity later. Engineer Amy Foster was completing a similar cleanup operation at the mining facility on asteroid belt XK7. The operation had been running smoothly for 2 years, extracting rare minerals using human-designed equipment that was supposedly primitive by galactic standards. The Korathi Trade Commission had filed 17 complaints about the mining methods, claiming they disrupted established shipping routes and violated environmental protection protocols. Amy knew the real reason for the complaints was that human mining was more efficient than anything the aliens had developed. The facility was extracting 3 times more material than Korathi projections had suggested was possible, using techniques that the aliens couldn't understand or replicate. Rather than admit their own limitations, they had simply decided that human methods must be inherently dangerous or illegal. She watched as the automated systems methodically dismantled the mining equipment and loaded it onto transport ships bound for Earth. The asteroid still held vast quantities of valuable minerals, but they would remain untouched until some alien corporation eventually moved in with inferior technology and half the efficiency. All across former human territory, similar scenes were playing out as diplomatic staff, researchers, miners, and explorers quietly packed up their operations and prepared to leave. There were no dramatic speeches or angry confrontations, no final demands or ultimatums. Humanity simply gathered its people and its possessions and walked away from 3 years of effort as if none of it had ever mattered. The aliens noticed the departures, of course, but they interpreted the human withdrawal as an admission of defeat. Clearly, the primitive mammals had finally realized they were out of their depth in galactic society. It was probably for the best, many alien commentators agreed. Humans had always seemed too unpredictable and aggressive to fit properly into the peaceful order that had governed the galaxy for millennia. What the aliens didn't notice was the careful way humans dismantled their facilities, ensuring that no useful technology or information was left behind. They didn't see the encrypted messages being transmitted to Earth, carrying detailed reports about alien capabilities and weaknesses. They didn't understand that the human departure was not a retreat, but a careful withdrawal by people who had learned exactly what they needed to know about their galactic neighbors. As Jake Morrison's transport ship lifted off from the Council station for the final time, he looked back at the massive structure where he had spent 3 years being ignored and dismissed. The aliens inside were probably already making plans to divvy up the territory humanity was abandoning. Confident that the troublesome mammals had finally learned their place in the cosmic order, Jake allowed himself a small smile as the station disappeared behind them. The aliens had no idea what they had just set in motion. High Counselor Vexstar stood before the massive viewing screen in the council chambers, watching the last human transport ship disappear into hyperspace. The reptilian leader's yellow eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he turned to address the assembled delegates from across the galaxy. 3 months had passed since the humans had quietly abandoned their pathetic attempt at joining galactic civilization, and now it was time to deal with the mess they had left behind. The chamber filled with the various sounds of alien approval as delegates settled into their seats. The blue-skinned Zephyrians hummed in harmonious tones while their large black eyes focused on the proceedings. The insect-like Korathi clicked their mandibles rhythmically, a sound that indicated eager anticipation among their species. Smaller delegations from a dozen other worlds added their own noises of agreement to the growing chorus of satisfaction. Vexstar raised one clawed hand and the chamber fell silent. His voice carried the authority of someone who had ruled this section of the galaxy for over 2 centuries, and every being in the room understood that what he said here would become law within days. The first item on today's agenda was simple, enough that even the most junior delegates could understand its importance. Old territory previously claimed by the human species would be reclassified as unclaimed space, available for proper colonization by civilized species who understood how galactic society actually worked. The humans had clearly been overwhelmed by the responsibility of managing multiple star systems, and their hasty retreat proved they were not ready for such duties. Trade Minister Zala of the Korathi delegation leaned forward in her specialized chair, her compound eyes reflecting the chamber's artificial lighting. She had been studying the reports about human-controlled territory for weeks, and the possibilities were even more promising than she had initially hoped. The mineral extraction operations alone would provide enough raw materials to fuel Korathi expansion for the next 50 years. Assuming they could improve upon the crude techniques the humans had been using, the asteroid mining facility at XK7 was particularly interesting because the humans had somehow managed to extract significantly more material than Korathi surveys had suggested was possible. Zala assumed this was due to reckless mining practices that ignored long-term sustainability. But whatever the reason, the asteroid still contained vast quantities of valuable resources that could be properly harvested using superior Korathi technology. Vexstar activated a holographic display, showing the 17 star systems that humans had abandoned during their retreat. Each system appeared as a glowing dot surrounded by detailed information about planetary resources, strategic importance, and existing infrastructure. The data had been compiled by Council Intelligence Services, who had been monitoring human activities for the past 3 years. Though their reports consistently described human technology as primitive and their methods as inefficient, the Zephyrian Science Directorate was particularly interested in the research facilities that humans had established throughout their territory. Director Kethmal had reviewed the official reports about human scientific activities and found them laughably basic compared to Zephyrian knowledge that had been accumulated over thousands of years. However, the facilities themselves were well constructed and could serve as useful starting points for real scientific research once they were upgraded with proper equipment. The research station on Kepler 442b had apparently been studying something called exotic matter, though the human reports were so poorly written that Zephyrian scientists could barely understand what the primitive mammals had been attempting to accomplish. Kethmal was confident that his people could use the existing infrastructure to conduct meaningful research into advanced physics, the kind of work that was clearly beyond human comprehension. Smaller alien delegations began voicing their own claims to various pieces of abandoned human territory. The Altarians wanted the agricultural worlds that humans had been developing, claiming they could increase food production using advanced hydroponic techniques. The Centauri Mining Consortium was interested in several uninhabited systems where humans had been conducting preliminary surveys for future expansion. Every delegate in the chamber seemed to have identified something valuable in the territories that humans had abandoned, and the mood in the room grew increasingly excited as they realized how much they stood to gain from humanity's failure to adapt to galactic civilization. It was almost amusing how the primitive species had done most of the hard work of initial colonization, only to give up and leave everything behind for more advanced civilizations to claim. Vexstar called for formal presentations from each major delegation, allowing them to state their territorial claims for the official record. The process took several hours as representatives outlined their plans for improving upon human efforts in mining, research, agriculture, and strategic defense. Every speaker made sure to emphasize how much better they could manage these resources compared to the chaotic and inefficient human approach. The Korathi delegation presented detailed projections, showing how they could triple the output of human mining operations within the first year of taking control. The Zephyrians outlined ambitious research programs that would finally unlock the secrets of advanced physics that had clearly been beyond human understanding. The Valdris Military Command explained how they could use former human outposts to strengthen defensive positions along the galactic rim. Not a single delegate expressed any concern about the speed of the human departure or questioned why such a supposedly primitive species had been able to establish functioning colonies across 17 star systems in just 3 years. The official reports describe human technology as crude and their methods as wasteful, so there seemed to be no reason to worry about hidden complications or unexpected surprises. As the day wore on, the chamber filled with an atmosphere of celebration. as delegates realized they were witnessing the largest territorial expansion opportunity in recent galactic history. Entire star systems with existing infrastructure were about to become available for colonization, and all because a species of aggressive mammals had finally realized they were out of their depth in civilized space. Vexstar called for the final vote as evening approached. The resolution was straightforward enough that even the newest council members could understand its implications. Old territory previously controlled by the human species would be immediately reclassified as unclaimed space, available for colonization by any council. Member species that could demonstrate proper management capabilities and adherence to galactic law. The vote was unanimous, as Vexstar had expected. 47 different species voted to approve the territorial redistribution, with 0 abstentions and 0 opposing votes. The humans had left behind a gift that would benefit the entire galactic community, even if they had been too primitive. To realize what they were giving up. As delegates began filing out of the chamber to begin organizing their colonization fleets, Vexstar remained standing before the viewing screen. Tomorrow would begin a new era of galactic expansion, built on the foundation of human failure and abandonment. It was probably the most useful thing the mammals had ever accomplished during their brief and unsuccessful venture into space. Commander Troy Barnes sat in the dark monitoring station at Volf 359, watching the screens that showed him everything happening in the surrounding star systems. The Deep Space Listening Post had been his home for the past 2 years, a lonely assignment that most officers tried to avoid. Troy actually preferred the isolation because it gave him time to think and observe. Without the constant chatter of a busy starship crew, the post was officially listed as abandoned in all human records. Just another piece of infrastructure left behind during the Great Withdrawal. In reality, it was one of dozens of hidden observation stations that continued to monitor alien activities in former human territory. Earth wanted to know exactly what their former galactic neighbors were planning to do with the system's humanity. Had abandoned, Troy's screens lit up with new contacts as the first Valdris colony ship entered the Ross 128 system. The massive vessel moved slowly through space, its engines producing the distinctive energy signature that marked it as one of the newest ships in the Valdris fleet. Intelligence reports suggested this particular ship was carrying over 10,000 colonists, along with enough equipment to establish a permanent settlement. The colony ship headed straight for the gas giant where Dr. Kevin Price had operated his research facility for 2 years before the withdrawal order came through. Troy had visited the facility once during a routine supply run and remembered being impressed by the sophisticated equipment that Price had installed there. The official reports described it as a basic geological survey station, but Troy had seen enough to know that something much more complex was happening inside those laboratory modules. The facility appeared completely dead as the Valdris ship approached. No power signatures registered on Troy's sensors, no communication signals, no signs of life or activity. To any casual observer, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. An abandoned research station that humans had simply walked away from when they decided to leave the galaxy behind. The Valdris boarding party consisted of 12 soldiers in full combat armor, led by a veteran officer named Catherine, who had served in the Valdris military for over 30 years. Troy watched through long-range sensors as their assault shuttle attached to the facility's main docking port and began cutting through the airlock with industrial plasma torches. It took them almost an hour to break through the sealed doors, which should have been their first warning that this was not a typical abandoned facility. The humans had clearly reinforced the station's security systems before leaving, but the Valdris team interpreted this as evidence of primitive paranoia rather than advanced preparation. Catherine led his team through the empty corridors of the research station, their helmet cameras transmitting everything back to the colony ship. The facility looked exactly like what the Council intelligence reports had described, a basic scientific outpost with simple equipment and crude computer systems. The humans had apparently removed most of their equipment before leaving, but they had left behind enough to give the Valdris a clear picture of their limited capabilities. The team made their way to what appeared to be the station's central control room, a circular chamber filled with outdated computer terminals and primitive display screens. Most of the equipment had been shut down or removed, but one control panel remained active in the center of the room. A single red button sat in the middle of the panel, surrounded by text written in the human language that the Valdris translation software was struggling to interpret. The translation program offered several possible meanings for the text around the button. It could be a power activation switch, an emergency system controller, or a data backup initiator. The software expressed low confidence in all of these translations, but Catherine was not particularly concerned about the details. In his experience, primitive species often labeled their equipment in confusing ways that made simple tasks seem more complicated than they actually were. Catherine had been ordered to secure the facility and prepare it for Valdris scientists who would arrive with the next wave of ships. That meant activating any remaining systems and downloading whatever data the humans had left behind. The red button seemed like the obvious place to start, especially since it was the only piece of equipment that still showed signs of being powered. He reached out with one clawed finger and pressed the button firmly. The click was satisfying and immediate, the kind of solid response that indicated quality engineering despite its primitive origins. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. The room remained quiet, the displays showed no changes, and the button itself simply stayed depressed under his finger. Then Troy's sensors began registering something impossible. The space around the research facility was changing in ways that violated everything he thought he knew about physics. The quantum field readings spiked beyond anything his instruments were designed to measure, creating patterns that looked more like abstract art than scientific data. The effects spread outward from the facility in an expanding sphere of altered space-time. Troy watched his sensor readings climb higher and higher as the distortion field grew larger and more complex. Whatever Dr. Price had been working on during his 2 years at the facility, it was definitely not basic geological research. The Valdris boarding team found themselves trapped inside a research station that was rapidly becoming the center of a space-time anomaly that defied explanation. Their communications with the colony ship became garbled and intermittent as the expanding field interfered with normal electromagnetic radiation. Emergency alerts began sounding throughout their ship as navigation systems reported readings that could not possibly be correct. Catherine tried to understand what was happening as his team's equipment began malfunctioning in ways that suggested the fundamental laws of physics were changing around them. The red button had not controlled a power system or a data backup. It had been something much more dangerous, a trigger for forces that the Valdris could not comprehend or control. Troy transmitted an emergency signal to Earth as he watched the distortion field continue expanding beyond the boundaries of the research facility. The signal was encrypted and sent through quantum communication channels that would take weeks to reach their destination, but Earth needed to know that the first phase of the plan had begun. Dr. Price's final gift to the galaxy was not the research data that the aliens expected to steal. It was a demonstration of exactly how much the supposedly primitive humans had learned during their brief time among the stars, and how thoroughly they had prepared for the possibility that their galactic neighbors might not be as civilized as they claimed to be. The wrong button had been pressed, and there was no way to undo what Catherine had just set in motion. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong came from the navigation officer aboard the Valdris colony ship Eternal Glory, Lieutenant Sektal had been monitoring the boarding operation when his instruments began displaying readings that made no sense according to everything he had learned about physics during his 20 years of military service. The stars were moving. Not the slow drift that happened over thousands of years as galaxies rotated through space, but actual visible movement that his sensors could track in real time. Entire constellations were shifting position as if space itself was being stretched and compressed like elastic material. The gas giant that housed the human research facility was still in the same location, but everything beyond it was dancing in ways that violated the basic laws of reality. Sektal called for Captain Mordak, who arrived on the bridge just as the ship's main computer began issuing warnings about navigation system failures. The hyperspace calculations that would normally allow them to return home were producing impossible results. According to their instruments, the distance to Valdris space was both expanding and contracting simultaneously, creating mathematical paradoxes that their computers could not resolve. Captain Mordek had commanded starships for 40 years and had never seen anything like the readings that were flooding his screens. The ship's sensors showed that local space was experiencing fluctuations in the fundamental constants that made faster-than-light travel possible. Whatever the humans had built inside that research facility, it was actively changing the nature of reality in the surrounding area. The effect was not limited to the Ross 128 system. Admiral Pete Coleman received emergency transmissions from hidden observation posts throughout former human territory as similar phenomena began manifesting. In system after system, every location where alien ships had entered abandoned human facilities was reporting the same impossible readings about altered spacetime and malfunctioning navigation systems. The pattern became clear within hours. The humans had not simply abandoned their research stations when they left the galaxy. They had converted them into weapons that could fundamentally alter the physics of space travel in ways that trapped anyone foolish enough to activate them. Each facility that the aliens explored and tried to claim became the center of an expanding bubble of twisted space-time. Dr. Susan Clark stood in the emergency briefing room at Earth's Colonial Defense Headquarters, explaining the situation to military officers who were struggling to understand what their former diplomatic partners had accomplished. Susan had worked with Dr. Price during the early stages of his exotic matter research, and she was one of the few people who understood the full implications of what was happening in former human space. The quantum field generators that Price had installed in each research facility were designed to create localized distortions in the fabric of space-time itself. When activated, they would begin producing an expanding field that altered the fundamental constants governing faster-than-light travel. Any ship caught within the affected area would find their FTL drives completely useless as the mathematical relationships that made hyperspace travel possible were being continuously modified. The beauty of the system was its elegance and permanence. Once triggered, the quantum generators would continue operating for thousands of years, powered by the very space-time distortions they were creating. The affected areas would remain impassable to conventional starships for longer than most civilizations had existed, effectively creating permanent barriers that could not be overcome through military force or technological advancement. Captain Rita Hoffman commanded the stealth reconnaissance ship Silent, running from her position at the edge of former human territory. Her mission was to observe alien reactions to the expanding distortion fields and report back to Earth about the effectiveness of the containment system. What she found exceeded even the most optimistic projections that human strategists had developed. The Valdris battle fleet that had been sent to secure the Ross 128 system was completely trapped within the expanding distortion field. 12 capital ships and their supporting vessels were functioning normally in terms of life support and basic systems, but their hyperspace drives had become useless pieces of exotic technology that could no longer interact properly with the altered space around them. The fleet was effectively marooned in a system that was becoming increasingly isolated from the rest of the galaxy. Similar situations were developing throughout former human space as alien colonization fleets found themselves trapped in systems they had intended to claim. The Korathi mining expedition to asteroid belt XK7 was reporting that their extraction equipment was malfunctioning due to altered gravitational constants. The Zephyrian research ships that had moved to claim human scientific facilities were discovering that their instruments could no longer take meaningful measurements in areas where the laws of physics were being continuously rewritten. The expanding distortion fields were not random in their effects. Price and his team had carefully calculated the parameters to ensure that the altered zones would eventually merge together, creating a vast region of impassable space that would effectively Quarantine former human territory from the rest of the galaxy. Any alien forces that entered the affected areas would become permanent residents whether they wanted to be or not. High Counselor Vexstar received the first reports about navigation failures with skepticism, assuming that the problems were temporary. Technical difficulties that could be resolved by competent engineers. As more ships reported similar issues and the pattern became undeniable, his skepticism turned to growing alarm about what the humans had actually been doing during their 3 years in galactic space. The Council's intelligence services had consistently reported that human technology was primitive and their scientific capabilities were limited to basic research. Now it appeared that the supposedly backward mammals had developed weapons that could alter the fundamental structure of reality itself, and they had done it so quietly that none of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations had noticed what was happening. Emergency meetings were called as the scope of the disaster became clear. 60% of the Council's military fleet was trapped in former human territory, along with millions of colonists and thousands of the galaxy's most advanced starships. The humans had not simply left the galaxy as everyone had assumed. They had created a massive trap and waited for their former neighbors to walk into it voluntarily. The most disturbing aspect of the situation was its permanence. The distortion fields showed no signs of weakening or dissipating over time. If anything, they appeared to be growing stronger as they expanded, suggesting that the affected areas would remain impassable for geological time periods. The aliens had not simply lost access to former human territory. They had lost access to it forever. 6 months had passed since Catherine pressed the red button that changed everything. The expanding space-time distortions had stabilized into 13 separate zones of altered physics, each one containing multiple star systems that were now completely cut off from the rest of the galaxy. The zones showed no signs of weakening or dissipating, and every attempt to penetrate them with conventional spacecraft had failed spectacularly. High Counselor Vexstar stood in the emergency session chambers that had become his second home since the crisis began. The Grand Council building felt empty now, with so many delegates trapped in the quarantine zones along with their fleets and colonies. The remaining representatives looked tired and defeated, nothing like the confident beings who had voted to claim human territory just months earlier. The communication array in the center of the chamber activated without warning, projecting a holographic image that made every alien in the room freeze with recognition. Jake Morrison appeared before them, looking exactly as he had during his 3 years as human ambassador. Except now he was smiling in a way that sent chills through every observer, who had dismissed him as primitive and irrelevant. Jake stood in what appeared to be a comfortable office on Earth, with windows showing a blue sky and green landscape that reminded the aliens of just how far away the human homeworld really was. He wore the same simple diplomatic uniform he had always worn, but somehow it no longer looked like the clothing of a defeated species. Begging for acceptance among their betters, his voice carried clearly through the chamber as he began to speak, using the same calm tone he had maintained during countless diplomatic meetings where his proposals had been rejected and his species had been insulted. The aliens listened in growing horror as Jake delivered a message that explained exactly what had happened to their fleets and colonies. Jake began by expressing his hope that the council members were enjoying their new territories in former human space. He noted that they would find these territories quite permanent, as human research into exotic matter applications had created stable and expanding regions of altered spacetime that would remain impassable for approximately 50,000 years. Give or take a few millennia depending on local gravitational conditions. The human ambassador continued by mentioning that humanity had tried to warn the Council about human persistence and ingenuity during their diplomatic tenure, but the alien representatives had seemed uninterested in listening to anything humans had to say. Jake suggested that the current situation should be considered a practical demonstration of why underestimating any species, especially one that had been consistently insulted and dismissed, tended to be a poor strategic choice for supposedly advanced civilizations. Vexstar felt his blood turn cold as Jake explained that the affected zones contained everything the aliens had claimed to want from human territory. The resources were still there, the technology was still functional, and the research facilities were still operational. The humans had simply ensured that anyone who took possession of these assets would have plenty of time to appreciate them properly, without the distraction of being able to leave or communicate with the outside galaxy. The message continued with Jake, revealing that humanity had decided to seek opportunities elsewhere in the galaxy, far from the Council-controlled regions where they had been treated as unwelcome primitives. Human exploration fleets were already establishing colonies in distant spiral arms, using advanced technologies that had been developed in secret during their 3 years of apparent diplomatic failure. Jake noted that humans had learned much from their time among the galactic community, particularly about the importance of being thorough in their preparations and never revealing their true capabilities to potential enemies. The Council had taught humanity valuable lessons about galactic politics, and humans were grateful for the education even if the teaching methods had been somewhat harsh. The coordinates that Jake provided at the end of his message corresponded to 13 different star systems, each one now completely isolated from galactic civilization by walls of twisted space-time that could not be penetrated or destroyed. The systems contained approximately 40% of the Council's military fleet, 60% of their industrial capacity, and millions of colonists who had volunteered for what they thought would be easy territorial expansion. As Jake's image faded from the holographic projector, the remaining Council members sat in stunned silence as they tried to process what they had just learned. The humans had not retreated from galactic society because they were overwhelmed or primitive. They had withdrawn because they were planning something that required the aliens to believe they were defeated and harmless. The reconnaissance reports that began arriving over the following weeks painted a picture that terrified the surviving Council leadership. Human colonies were appearing throughout the galaxy, always in regions far from Council space and always defended by weapons and technologies that seemed impossible based on previous human capabilities. The ships that protected these colonies used propulsion systems that operated on principles the aliens could not understand, and their defensive capabilities suggested access to energy sources that violated known physics. Trade routes that had connected Council worlds for thousands of years were being disrupted by human activities that the aliens could not counter or predict. Human merchants appeared in neutral systems offering technologies that made Council products obsolete overnight. Human exploration vessels were mapping regions of space that Council scientists had declared impossible to reach with conventional, faster-than-light travel. The most disturbing reports came from Council intelligence services that had tried to infiltrate human space and gather information about their new colonies. Every mission failed completely, with agents simply disappearing without trace once they entered regions that humans controlled. It was as if humanity had developed the ability to detect and neutralize any attempt at espionage before it could gather useful information. Vexstar realized that the Council had made a fundamental error in their understanding of human nature and capabilities. They had assumed that a species new to galactic civilization must be primitive and limited in their knowledge. They had interpreted human diplomatic efforts as signs of weakness rather than reconnaissance missions designed to gather intelligence about potential enemies. The humans had spent 3 years carefully studying every aspect of Council society, technology, and military capabilities while pretending to be interested in peaceful cooperation. They had identified weaknesses and blind spots that the aliens never suspected existed. Most importantly, they had prepared contingency plans for the possibility that their neighbors might prove to be hostile and untrustworthy. Now the galaxy was divided into 2 regions separated by barriers that could not be crossed. On one side were the surviving Council worlds, weakened by the loss of their fleets and colonies. On the other side was expanding human space, protected by technologies that made direct confrontation impossible and populated by beings who had learned to never trust their neighbors again. The Council's attempt to claim easy territory had backfired in ways that would reshape galactic civilization for thousands of years to come.